Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm Professor Crimsy, and in today's class I will teach you how to create a variety of special effects to improve your illustrations using blur filter and blur brushes in Clip Studio Paint. We will start off with a quick overview of all the available filters and brushes, and then I will teach you step by step how I create my 7 personal favorite special effects using some of these tools. These effects include Lineart enhancement, movement blur, glow highlights, distance blur, smoke and falling snow, as well as a 90s anime aesthetic filter. That being said, we have a lot to cover, so without further ado, let's begin the ritual. First off, let's do a quick overview of the filters and brushes that are present by default in Clip Studio Paint. We have the Blur and Blur Strong filters. These are automatic filters that have a set value to them. To really see a difference, you typically need to use them multiple times, but it can be pretty subtle. I personally prefer their superior cousin, the Gaussian Blur. This is by far the one I use the most in my art because it comes with a strength slider and a preview of the result that updates every time you move the slider, which gives you a lot of control on your final result. With the motion blur, a forward or backward directional movement is added to your blur. You can control its strength, its direction, and how smooth it is, which is great for any element in your art showcasing lateral movement, like a character running or an object falling, for example. Where the motion blur is great to create movement, the radial blur is its equal when it comes to creating intensity. This blur filter is also directional, but instead of being linear, this one originates from a single point and projects the blur effect in an outward or inward direction. The smoothing filter is pretty self-explanatory. If you have a high amount of grain in your art, which happens a lot with scanned traditional artworks brought into a digital drawing software, this will serve as an anti-aliasing filter, but note that it can also be pretty subtle. Another filter I consider to be a blur filter, but that was not included in the blur category, is the mosaic filter, also known as the pixelate filter or the censorship filter. As its name indicates, this filter is pretty great to automatically pixelate an image, to give it a pixel art look, or to blur a certain part of your art. You get the gist. Moving on to the blend and blur brushes. These are also very self-explanatory, but here's how they work. We have the regular blend brush, which blends. We have the blur brush, which also blends color together but blurs them first, just like so. We have the fingertip brush. This one drags and stretches your colors while also slightly blurring them. We also have the Painterly blender that simulates blending paints, the wet bleed blender that simulates blending watercolors, the textured blender, which doesn't really blend that much, but it adds a really nice texture if you've already blended your colors. And that's pretty much it. Let's start with a pretty basic effect, yet a very effective one. Lineart enhancement is the best way to add depth and strength to your line art. Simply select your Lineart folder, right-click the folder and go to Duplicate Layer, right-click the folder again and go to Merge Selected Layers. Now go to the top menu, click on Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. I left the value at 6 since my canvas is letter size, but you may want a higher value the bigger your canvas is. As you can see, it makes a pretty big difference already, but if you want to go an extra step, you can also lock the layer's pixels and change its blending mode to multiply, then pick a color of your choice and go to Edit, Fill, or use the shortcut Alt-Delete. As long as you don't put Control in front of that, you're gonna be okay. Now, not only does the line art look bolder, but it also has a nice colored hue to it. Once you're fully done with the coloring and shading of your character, a nice effect you can add is movement blur. It may not apply in every scenarios, but in this case, it's winter, the wind is blowing, and many elements of my characters are in motion because of it, like the dangling yokai lanterns, the ribbons, and the bottom of the kimono and its sleeves. To create this effect, I isolated my character from the background by duplicating its folder and merging the layers together. It's important to keep the original folder visible under this layer because we will be erasing parts of this image in the process. So, to create movement blur, select the area in motion and go to Filter, Blur, Motion Blur. Adjust the settings to get the right strength and angle and press OK. Next, all that's left to do is erase the parts we don't want to be blurry and rinse and repeat for all the moving elements. Once you're done, you can also duplicate the layer to strengthen the effect a bit, merge the two layers together and play with the layer's opacity until you're happy with the result. The final effect here is subtle, but I was not going for anything too dramatic, so it's perfect as it is. Next up, something that can really add a punch to your artwork is glowing highlights. There are many ways to create glow in your art, but here's the 3 methods I use the most. First, create a new layer and put its blending mode on Add Glow. Next, choose a dark color in the same hue as the element you want to add glow to, and draw on top of said elements with a hard brush. Once you're done, head over to the top menu, Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, adjust the settings to make the highlights very blurry, and press OK. Now you can adjust the layer's opacity and use the soft eraser to refine the edges of the glow, and that's all there is to it. The other method also goes over the gold parts with a hard brush, but instead of using the Gaussian Blur filter, go to the blend brushes and pick either the blend or the blur brush. Then simply blend around the glowing areas until it looks smooth, and voila! Now the third method is the simplest in my opinion, but it's not as precise as the first two. You can simply grab the soft airbrush and gently dab on top of your element until you're satisfied with the glowing effect. This is especially good for spherical glowing objects and wide areas of glow, but feel free to experiment with all of these methods, it's really a matter of personal preference. Now that our character is packing a punch, it's about time we start giving some love to its surroundings. First, let's add our background elements, then our foreground and middle ones. To create an interesting composition in your illustrations, it's always important to add both background and foreground elements to it, so that we get a good sense of depth from the environment around the character. Typically, the further away those elements are from the character and the blurrier they get in the distance. And we call this the depth of field effect. Of course, everything looks very flat right now, so let's go on a Gaussian blur rampage. First, slightly blur the sky and the mountains separately, then merge the two together and blur them again, but much stronger this time. The goal here is to have them be very blurry to show how far away they are. Next, slightly blur the pine tree branch in the middle ground. Having this one be less blurry will help accentuate just how far the other branches are from our character. So lastly, strongly blur the pine tree branches in the foreground and we're done! Now our composition looks pretty nice and we can really feel the depth in our environment. Moving on to a more tricky effect, let's create some smoke coming out of the carved oni pipe our character is holding. This effect might seem fancy, but in truth, it's only a few steps that you rinse and repeat many times until you get the desired result. Sadly, I lost my initial recording from when I created this version of the smoke effect, so I will quickly go over the whole process again, and I apologize in advance if the final result doesn't look as polished or is a bit different. As long as you understand the process, then you should be able to reproduce it. The trick is to go from broad details to smaller details, and the hardest part is pretty much to get the right smoke shape at the start. What you need for that is a good soft paintbrush like the round mixing brush. Gently trace the shape of your smoke. Imagine that it is very light and floating in the air in long, thin strands, a bit like hair in a way. Then get the blur brush and gradually blur the strands of smoke that you just made. Don't hesitate to erase to refine your shapes, or if you feel like your smoke is a bit too opaque, you can use the soft eraser, just like I did here. From there, I use a combination of the flat marker brush and the fingertip brush to add more layers of smoke on top of what I already had. This is our medium level of details. When I was happy with the result, I duplicated the smoke layer, put the blending mode on Add Glow, and reduced both layers' opacity. Then, on the third layer, we can draw the thinnest strands of smoke. For this, I used the flat marker at a smaller size and simply went over the lines we made before to add this extra level of detail that makes it look like the smoke is slowly dissipating. With these 3 levels of details, we end up with some really good looking smoke. So finally, all that's left to do is to bring the smoke layers in a group. Don't forget to put the folder on the blending mode true, otherwise the blending mode's effects are not going to apply on the background. Then duplicate it, merge the new folder's layers, put its blending mode on add glow, and blur it using the Gaussian blur filter. Lastly, you can play with the layer's opacity or lock the layer's pixel to give it a colored hue. And that's it! We now have a really cool looking smoke effect to go with our pipe accessory, and it's not too far out from the first one I made, so I'm pretty happy despite it being done in half the time. After all we've gone through, I'm happy to say that this next effect is refreshingly simple to create. Creating this effect of falling snow is very similar to other particle effects like floating dust and rain. All you need to do is head over to the airbrush tab, grab the droplet brush, and lightly dab around the environment to simulate falling snowflakes. The only things to avoid here is to make the particles too dense or too big. If you add too many of them, it just won't be as effective, but otherwise that's all there is to it. When you're happy with your snowflakes, go to the top menu, Filter, Blur, Motion Blur, and play around with the angle and the strength until it feels like the snowflakes are falling and just gently being blown in the wind. Then, like we did many times before, duplicate the layer, change its blending mode to Add Glow, and use the Gaussian blur filter to add some highlights to it. After that, just play around with the layer's color and opacity until the snow has a nice shiny blue tint to it. Do these steps again for the foreground snowflakes, but this time use the spray airbrush and make the particle size bigger to simulate snowflakes that are closer to the viewer. Use the motion blur filter again, play around with the settings, and press OK. As you can see here, I scaled up my snowflakes because they still looked a bit too small, and I gave them an extra pass of Gaussian blur to make them even more fuzzy. Finally, duplicate the layer, put the new layer's blending mode on Add Glow and the first layer on the blending mode screen, and adjust their opacity to your taste. At this point, we can call the illustration pretty much done, but there is one last effect to apply to it that will change everything. And that's a nice, fancy-looking 90s anime aesthetic filter. To achieve this effect, you must create a folder that will contain your entire artwork. Duplicate it, combine all the layers together, and hide the original folder. Now duplicate that artwork layer and apply a strong Gaussian blur filter to it. Reduce its opacity to more or less 50% and merge the 2 layers together. Next, create 3 layers and duplicate your artwork layers 3 times as well. Then head over to the color set tab and make sure it is showing the standard color set because this one has all the original RGB colors in it. Pick the pure red and fill the first layer with it. Then do the same for the green color and finally the blue color. This follows the RGB order as you might have noticed. Now move one of each artwork layer copies below each RGB layers and put the RGB layers on multiply. Merge the RGB layers to the artwork layer below them and then change the top 2 layers blending mode to screen. Now, remember that sort of 3D effect in those old RGB TVs because their color channels were slightly misaligned? We're going to create that effect moving the bottom 2 layers ever so slightly sideways, starting with the red layer to the right and the green layer to the left. It is pretty subtle, but we do not want to move them too far apart, otherwise it will blur the image too harshly. When you like the result, simply merge all the layers together once more, and that's it! Now all that's left to do is to add a noise filter on top of your artwork. Any filter will do, but I was recommended this noise filter a while ago, and I love it, so I will recommend it to you as well. You can find it on the Clip Studio Asset Store for free, simply download it, fetch it in your download folder, and drag and drop it in your canvas. Change the layer's blending mode to overlay and reduce its opacity to more or less 30%, and here you go! Adding noise on overlay to your image will darken it a bit, so if that's not something that you like, duplicate your artwork image and change the copy's blending mode to screen. Reduce its opacity to 30, and there you go! Your artwork is lighter again. I just love this effect so much. It's one of those effects that just always looks good. It would be even better if the art that I drew was initially drawn in the 90s anime art style, but it still works very well nonetheless. And at long last, our illustration is finished! And dare I say, it looks pretty awesome! Here's a rundown of all the effects we created today and how they each improve the piece. Some of these might seem less important when singled out, but all these effects can really improve your art dramatically once combined together. Alright, class dismissed. I hope you learned something useful today. Give an apple to the teacher by joining our community below, and while you wait for our next session, why not check out my other Clip Studio Paint tutorials? We're starting to have a lot of them. Thanks for watching! Au revoir!